Always like you.
Next, go to my good friend from Colorado, Mr. Nagoose. Gosh, this is wonderful. Mr. Massey, you know, it's kind of up to you now.
I want to thank the witnesses for coming in, and I want to thank all three of them for coming back. And I yield back.
Okay, thank you very much. My good friends from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll give a few moments to let the witnesses and myself catch the breath. Everybody, great. So I love seeing this sort of kidding and relationship that you're just displaying here, because I remember coming in at the same time as Representative Weiss as a freshman, and when you were chair, constantly telling us about it's got to be four corners. Like, how many times do we hear it's got to be four corners? And so I looked back up, and it looks to me like the last time we passed an appropriations bill, it was 361 in the House to 69. That number tells us that it was an incredibly bipartisan four-corner bill. In the Senate, it was 68 to 31. And that's, as you've pointed out, what appropriators do, but they negotiate all four corners. And it is the one time when our Congress, on both sides, talk to each other and negotiate. So, you know, Representative Bice, did you vote for the Fiscal Responsibility Act?
Yes.
And Representative Joyce, did you also vote for the Responsibility Act?
Is that this year?
You're being told you did.
I'm trying to remember what is.
FRA.
From this year?
FRA.
Yes, the one this year. The budget deal, yeah. So I think that was also one of those moments where we had Americans really scared, markets scared, the world scared, that we were not going to be able to actually get the job done and we were going to default. And instead, there was a bill passed with 149 Republicans and 165 Democrats that was not the favorite of maybe anybody, but that's the nature of legislation, it's the art of compromise. And we just heard the ranking member say, I didn't like it, but I am going to work towards that. And I think that's what's so worrisome for my community and for people who talk to me. I pointed out that the car dealers were in my office last week saying, you don't understand that when we don't have appropriations, it hurts my dealership because federal employees or people related who have contracts, and New Mexico has a lot of service members and federal employees and people with contracts, they don't get the work on their cars done, right? And so it's a ripple effect. So I think that this is why it is so scary that we're not doing this, that we're at this moment again, and we have this short-term funding bill that really gives the extreme MAGA Republicans 4 more weeks, and we don't know what the next demands are going to be, because I read it like you encouraged us to, and it is not just 8% cut, it's 8.1285%. It's very precise about how much is being cut, and that's what it says. Everything is cut except for these very small areas. Ranking Member DeLauro, we've talked a lot about energy tonight, and when we start looking, there's both the 8.1285% cuts, but there's also the agricultural appropriations bill even looks at more cuts. Electric co-ops serve people in my community and people in almost every one of the members' communities here. Can you tell us what's going to happen to electric co-ops if we continue down this path?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's the point. First of all, with regard to the agriculture side of this, with the cuts, we're looking at guaranteed loans to farmers, which are going to be cut very seriously. It's $536 million less for direct and guaranteed farm ownership loans, and let me see if I can put it this way. There's been a lot of talk about how the 8% cuts are only for 31 days. But the cuts in the House Republican funding bills for the full year are even steeper. That is where you will see that the cuts to rural electric co-ops, which will decimate the energy sector there and the cost of energy, which people are so concerned about. And that is in the bill. So that is a much steeper cut. You didn't ask me about education, but if you go to those regular funding bills, which is where they want to go with 31 days is to work out these bills, we're talking about the Title I program in education as an 80% cut in Title I, just about eliminating public education in this country.
80% cut in Title I, and I think we need to remind Americans what Title I means, and that means those schools who have higher poverty levels, and they're the schools that need it most. And that's why the federal government comes in and provides some assistance. And so we're going to cut it 80%.
80%. They want to cut it 80%, which is the cornerstone of our federal investment in public education. So your point is that if it's 8%, 8.1%, some instances like LIHEAP, 65%, or you look at Army Corps, which is I think 18%. You look at the wildfire suppression of funding, it's a cut of about 44%. So there's significant cuts. But if you get to the bills that they talk about wanting to get to, the regular bills, the cuts are staggering in terms of where they want to try to go in these efforts. And so you can't, it's not 8%. It's a heck of a lot more. And in the agriculture bill, they would take the agriculture bill back to 2007 in terms of the numbers. For the labor H bill, it's to 2008. And it is the same for several of the other appropriations bills. So, and I'll make the point again, it's 31 days, but we cannot craft a final bill in 31 days. You need at least 6 weeks in order to do this. So that means if you have another continuing resolution, you're going to look at the same cuts, which are going to be extended into not 30 days, but 60 days and more, which is really unbelievably harmful to folks.
And I think that that's the concern that my constituents have, and even when I go to places that aren't New Mexico, is that the Fiscal Responsibility Act set out the framework. And the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, am I correct, that they've been following what we agreed to?
That's right.
Right? And the Senate has passed out appropriation bills consistent with what we agreed to, with what 149 and 165 Democrats agreed to.
Yeah, the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, are adhering to the budget agreement, and which is what we should do. But I'm going to just, because I asked for this information. Agriculture cuts in the full year bill, $1 billion cut to rural electric co-ops, a $500 million cut from the Rural Energy for America program. For your purposes, it's $15 million cut from New Mexico alone, $4 billion cut from the at-risk agricultural operations. That is in the full year bill, which is where they want to go in the next tranche here. So 31 days is not the end of this process. 31 days opens the door to the massive, massive cuts in the appropriations bills.
And I have a very large rural district, but so do many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And what you're pointing out is the number of farm loan borrowers, about 104,000. That's farmers. Those are small farmers that really need this help.
And that's in the CR.
Yeah.
That is in the CR.
Yeah. And I think that's something we need to think about is what are we doing to our economy? What are we doing to our rural economy with these kinds of cuts? I could go on. We were talking about, police and law enforcement, earlier when we were talking about other things. And we need to remember my local police departments. I just met with my sheriffs, all the sheriffs in New Mexico, and the local police, burn, JAG, and COPS programs. Those are going to be cut. Like sort of these small local police forces rely on this extra money they get from the federal government, and those are going to be cut. Ranking member.
Yes, yeah, no, these are programs, we're looking at making communities less safe, fewer law enforcement officers on the beat apprehending fugitives, or fighting, we're all worried about fentanyl and opioid trafficking, So it is a serious cutback in law enforcement across the board.
Right.
Across the board.
So when we were talking about as we began the High Wire Act that we did when there was a threat to default on America, I asked the Republican budget chairman about the drastic cuts to rural communities. I asked him, how do I go back and I explain this to my rural communities? And he told me, open quote, you should tell them that we have to prioritize. And what this tells me is we are not prioritizing the people who need it most. We're not prioritizing rural America when we do these kinds of cuts.
Well,
Ranking
across
member-
the board cuts don't prioritize, it's just
It's across the board, so we don't look at it. But, Ranking member, can you explain to us, when we do these kinds of cuts and look at cuts only, who are the Republicans protecting? Like, what for? Why can't we do something else?
Well, I said a few moments ago that I think that the view that the spending or public investments in people's lives, their economic future, I think is a proper role for the government. But there doesn't seem to be the same view as to the revenue and of how we are getting revenue from the wealthiest corporations, many of whom don't pay any taxes. It's not even a question, as I said, of paying a fair share. They just don't pay taxes at all. And so there is a shortage of revenue. And so that you got tax cheats, you got corporations, et cetera, who wind up getting the special breaks and the tax credits, et cetera. And that's something that should be looked at in a very substantial way. And you will look at the notion, not here, of cutting back on the IRS and hiring of people that will go after, if you will, the tax cheats. But that's not a road some of my Republican colleagues want to go down.
So instead, we're cutting essential programs from law enforcement to our farmers instead of making sure that everybody pays their fair share in taxes, protecting the wealthiest
And as I say,
corporations.
it's not even fair share. We have corporations, over 30 in this nation, who pay no taxes at all.
Yeah. That,
Another 70 or 80 who don't pay what they're supposed to be paying in taxes. But we failed to go after them and make the case that that would add to the revenue that we need and we have in order to deal with making public investments.
so we could have public investments as long as if we did that.
Will the
I
gentle-
also
will-
heard a
will the-
lot of.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I also.
Would this not apply also to the president's family to pay their fair share?
But I
yield
think
back.
that's the.
It's
that-
any
that's-
president's
that's-
family.
That makes no sense whatsoever
It's
in
any
terms of what we're
president's
talking about.
family.
Yeah, everybody's family should pay their fair
Yeah,
share.
right.
So we talked a lot about border security. We also had a ranking member DeLauro talk about how we're actually cutting border security. I wanted, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 articles by the Cato Institute, which I understand is often described as a more conservative institute. The first one is titled, President Trump Reduced Legal Immigration. He did not reduce illegal immigration.
Without objection.
The second article is that fentanyl is smuggled into the United States for U.S. citizens, by U.S. citizens, and not by asylum seekers.
Without
And
objection.
Thank you very much. And I think a lot of what we need to start looking at is increasing what we need to go after fentanyl, because it is destroying our communities. And so we need to invest in those things, including making sure we don't cut law enforcement like this bill does and like their agriculture appropriations bill does. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for any questions he cares to pose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congresswoman Bice and Congressman Joyce, thank y'all for being here. Y'all negotiated great. We got a great dialogue going. This is a healthy conversation we're having. The issue that my good friends on the other aisle will never admit is this piece of clothing on Congressman Massey. What is it, 30 trillion?
33.
33 trillion. I keep hearing spending from the other side. Spending, you name all these programs that have an 8% cut, they get 92%, but they've got an 8% cut. And granted, they're great programs, but I was on a plane the other day, and I was just thinking, after listening to the dialogue to the friends on my left, you know, you can have airplane carries people of every ilk. They do veterans, take them different things. They have an airplane is a great thing that serves a lot of people. But if it's out of gas, the whole plane goes down. Y'all are willing to let the plane go down, and I guess just try to keep spending until there's no more. And that's the issue I have. And to bring up, to be honest, to bring up law enforcement cuts when y'all are the party that wants to do away with law enforcement. When you bring up the border and deny that the border is just open, and you bring up health care, what about the illegals that are coming across the border with no test? You don't know what they're bringing in. And so it's kind of ironic that we're even having this discussion. But that being said, thank y'all. I've got some issues with it. I have no faith in this administration, none. To give him, and Chip has brought up the things on the border, which are great. Do I think in 30 days this man will actually obey the law when he's violated everything in the law, in the Constitution for an invasion? No, I do not. Do I think that it will finally dawn on him that he has to do this? No. I'm a big proponent, and I've told the chairman this. I think the 12 appropriation bills ought to be passed. Now, can we do it by September 30th? Probably not. But that's the right way to have a top line to see if we can make a dent in the debt of this country, because people now are getting it, particularly with the rampant spending, the $2 trillion that we're going in debt now. I'm tired of hearing about the optics of a shutdown. I will tell you this, shutting the complete country down is a reality. It's not an optic. And that's what I see coming down the pipe. Americans are feeling it in their pocketbook. And so I'm going to vote against it in rules in this committee. And we're going to, over the next, 12 days, I hope we'll go to work and come to an agreement. I will tell you, y'all have been great, though, in trying to come up with a solution. We all want the same thing. We do. But we got those on the other side that do not. And that's the seriousness of the situation as we see it now. So thank you thank you for what you're doing.
Would the gentleman yield for 1 second?
Yes, ma'am, don't filibuster. Mr.
No,
Lawrence.
I won't. I always try to deal with facts, though. But I would say you were going to vote against this. What would it take for you to vote? What would you be wanting to vote for?
Same thing we've always stated earlier, 12 appropriations passed in regular order, a top line limit of 1.47, instead of the 6-point Pelosi-Schumer debt. And I just, it's insane to even consider that. So that's what I think. Now, can we do it by the September 30th? No. But I'm sorry, we're not, we're where we are for a lot of different reasons. And there are a lot of us, including these two sitting here, are very frustrated, as well as all of us are. Because I would have liked to have had this in June or July, at least had the discussion. We were out the whole month of August. And so, but we've got so many things in common that I want to stress that we're trying to solve the problem. We will come up with a solution. And I feel good about coming up with a meeting of the mind.
Do you think we should do something about revenue in terms
Not,
of?
your definition, in all due respect, is just tax the evil corporations. Corporations don't pay tax. The shareholders do. People do.
Yeah, but do you think that
Corporations
they
don't pay.
shouldn't pay any tax? Some of them.
Corporations pay tax. It's those in this administration that I think are coming to light that pay no tax, meaning from China and meaning from this family, Biden family. It's a family of corruption. But that being said, thank you all for what you're doing. I'm looking
Thank you.
forward to coming up with a solution.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, recognized for any questions he has for the panel.
Thank the chairman. Quick question for either Mr. Joyce or Ms. Bice, either one. We've heard some facts thrown around here about adherence to the FRA. And my recollection was that there was a significant amount of conversations going on between both Chair Murray and Ranking Member Collins about tacking on an additional $14 billion, an additional 24 spending, as well as add emergency funding on top of the $23 billion that they were negotiating on the side. And a lot of that's still fluid. But my point is, it's not exactly a 100% adherence over on the Senate side to the exact terms of the FRA. Is that, would you agree, based on my understanding, that that's correct?
Based on your understanding, that is correct. And I would also add that they haven't actually been able to get anything across the finish line either. They've passed these out of committee, but they haven't put anything on the floor as well.
And might I add, in addition to that reality, that what we're talking about here, albeit disagreements on the relative level of spending in this deal for the Department of Defense and veterans versus non-defense, non-veteran spending, recognizing that is different than the FRA structure, that the overall spending level is maybe not to the dollar, but effectively commensurate the same at a top-line level as the FRA deal, for better or worse. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so in trying to keep with the spirit of the FRA deal, even for those who voted for it or those who voted against it, that is what is true about this proposal currently before us, correct?
That is correct.
And is it not also correct that in this proposal before us, we maintain the level of defense spending that was passed in the FRA?
That is correct.
And is it not also correct that we are maintaining the level of veteran spending, whether it's through the FRA, it's the same as basically 2023 plus a couple of billion, but we're keeping that the same, correct?
Correct.
So what we're trying to accomplish in this piece of legislation, and I'm speaking to some of my conservative brothers and sisters in this, I hesitate to use the word august body, that we are then reducing spending for the remainder, the non-defense, non-veteran discretionary spending, by just over 8%. Is that correct across the board?
That is correct.
Now, in doing so, we are basically, that would be about half of what it would take to get to what many in this conference wanted to achieve, which is getting back to pre-COVID level area spending of 2019. In other words, about 8% would get you about halfway there for, again, the non-defense, non-veterans discretionary spending. Does that sound right to you? That's what I understand from people studying the numbers.
I will take your word for that.
I think that is roughly correct. And so my point of bringing that up is to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who unsurprisingly criticize the 8% reductions and walk through the parade of horribles. But remember that at some point here, we have to get off the merry-go-round. We have to recognize what we're doing to the American people, our economy, and spending with respect to inflation. And we're trying to find a path to any sort of fiscal responsibility or sensibility. And that the response from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is effectively a generic statement of taxation. And so I would ask the gentlelady, the ranking member, I would ask, would it be your preference that we have a $2 trillion deficit this year? Do you believe we should increase taxes $2 trillion? In other words, or stated differently, $20 trillion over 10 years.
Yeah, let me just say this. First of all, the premise that this is in keeping what we're talking about with the FRA, this is billions of dollars lower than the FRA.
Say that again, how much?
Billions of dollars lower than what the FRA suggested. And I'll take a look at what this is. So this is lower than the FRA. We're not dealing with apples and apples here. So, but just to say this, there is got to be a balance here somewhere. I have cut spending. I negotiated a budget bill last December with Republicans and Democrats.
Right, but
House and Senate.
But we're talking about being $2 trillion in deficit spending this year. $2 trillion.
Well, let me ask you-
When we're $33 trillion in debt.
Well, but the fact of the matter is that you have no, what, and I'm assuming that the 2017 tax cuts were something that were embraced. And there was no...
The revenue as a percentage of GDP had never been higher than it was a year ago, other than about the same height
revenue is
in
not-
2000 and in 19...
revenue is not. We are not...
As a percentage of GDP,
Well,
as effectively 2 years ago, revenue had only been at that level twice before in the history of this country, ever.
Well,
That's just true.
There is no desire to deal with a balance between revenue and spending.
But hold on a
With
second.
all of
If we
the-
were at the highest level as a percentage of GDP that we've ever been, give or take,
Well,
a percentage.
I'm not going to take, I'm going to look at the numbers myself. I just don't take what you say by fiat here, is that is the absolute.
Well,
that
as I
is
say,
the-
let me Google that for you. It is in
Well,
fact
thank you.
the case that as a percentage of GDP, again, effectively about a year or two ago.
Well, where were you on the tax cuts in 2017? That was okay to do what we did, which was
But
$2 trillion.
the 2017
It was
tax cuts
$2 trillion.
resulted
It-
in
no,
the
it did
2017
not.
cuts.
It didn't.
We ended up having, as of this time,
Right.
Could you have a spirited discussion?
Right.
Just please, one at a time.
I hear you. Thank
the
you.
highest revenue as a percentage of gross domestic product that we've ever had.
Listen, my friend, that the people who benefited the most were the people who were at the 0.1% of the people in this nation, and the corporations and the special interests. Working Americans and middle-class families did not see the benefit of those tax cuts. And there was no one on your side of the aisle that expressed any view
so again,
that
going back
this
to
was going to
Ms.
add to the
Laura,
deficit.
So
$2
going
trillion.
back to the
Sorry.
main point here, okay?
$2 trillion.
And in my time here, the point here is we had the highest percentage of revenue as a percentage of gross domestic product. And again, I'm saying give or take, there was two other times in history about the same level, 2000 and I can't remember, I don't know, maybe right after the war sometime. And so we had the highest percentage revenue. So as they say, it's not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem.
It's a revenue.
Now, it's not a revenue problem.
It is.
We have had for a long time an understanding of where we were going to be heading with respect to mandatory spending. For a long time, we've been watching that grow, knowing it's coming. We've done nothing about it. Neither party, by the way, has done nothing about it. So here we sit, and we're trying to constrain spending. We're trying to constrain spending in the discretionary pot, not really yet touching, obviously, mandatory, which neither party has been willing, frankly, to go down that road. My point here is we've got legislation in front of us, and again, speaking to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, as well as to people on the conservative block of this conference, that whether you love it or don't love it, it is legislation that would reduce spending. Again, speaking to my conservative colleagues who are out railing about this not doing anything, it would cut spending 8% for non-defense, non-veteran discretionary spending, which is significant, as evidenced by the concerns of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle of what that might mean for certain programs that the gentlelady outlined and so forth. I believe that it's an important constraint, a constraint on the bureaucracy to be able to pull back and force adherence. So for example, with DHS, the natural and predictable talking point about saying, oh, well, this is going to cut 8% of DHS, resulting in X billion dollars of cuts. Well, just for the average person listening out there, it is still higher than the 2021 levels that we were spending for DHS. It is only fractionally below that of the 2022 levels. My point being, DHS can figure out, like every other business or human has to do, how to manage its affairs without continual increases in spending. All we're saying is, yes, with DHS and every other agency, you need to figure out how to tighten the belt. The point of adding HR 2, it's not to the response to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. It is not hypocritical or contradictory to say you believe you need to have the policy choices that are supposed to be followed in the law being followed, as HR 2 evidences, and then say you can do that with whatever the total is, $60X billion instead of $60Y billion. I don't know the exact numbers, but a reduction in your budget. It's not saying you can't do that. What we're saying is, and by attaching HR 2, we are trying to address the fundamental and complete debacle that is the southern border and what that now means for the rest of our country. I mean, the fact is, in my news feed that I get sent to me regularly from my staff, there is a constant stream every day of the impact of the border on our country in Texas. In just this morning's news feed, I had a story about 2,200 migrants in Eagle Pass and a mass crowd. I had a story about the masses in the Darien Gap. I had a story about the masses on a train in empty cars riding up through Mexico. I had a story about migrants and human smugglers wearing camouflage and jumping across walls and having video of that happening and getting away without being found. We have stories of the hundreds of rounds of ammunition and IED found on Texas soil on this side of the Rio Grande. We have stories of less than 4 days ago, a 10-year-old boy drowning in the Rio Grande while crossing with his mom. We have the story in years past of last year. This is an example of the 53 individuals who died in a tractor trailer in San Antonio. A story this morning, a more recent one, that was an older one, of Texas ranchers who live and work near the border are having their properties destroyed by the increase of illegal migrants trespassing. The stories of the local communities in Texas who are dealing with the impact on their schools, their hospitals, and their local economies. Going down the list of all of the impacts of what we're doing in Texas, the $10 billion, the $10 billion, you want to talk about appropriations? The $10 billion that Texans have appropriated to manage dealing with the border crisis, where the federal government, it's still my time, where the federal government is utterly refusing to do its job. $10 billion that the taxpayers of Texas have borne to manage dealing with it. The Texas Department of Public Safety that have intercepted and found 432 million lethal doses of fentanyl. That's what they've intercepted as DPS after it gets past Border Patrol because of how bad it is in Texas. And my Democrat colleagues scoff at this notion. And this is what is at the centerpiece of what we're trying to accomplish in this legislation. And so just a very direct message to my so-called conservative colleagues who right now apparently are ready to walk away from legislation that would, for 30 days, cut the non-defense, non-veteran spending for the discretionary spending by 8% and attaching HR 2, a bill that would massively reform our border and try to force the president to do his job, along with a Department of Defense bill that is funded at the level we embraced before, that would fund our troops and would undo a lot of the damage. I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't agree. A lot of the damage of the social engineering of the Department of Defense. That is something that a number of my colleagues are willing to walk away from. I don't agree. And I applaud my colleagues here for working together to try to get that accomplished. I will stand alongside them and advocate for it. We have to find a path forward that doesn't involve just walking away and saying, nah, can't do that. We have an obligation to do it. And I will fight as hard as I can to get the most conservative and strongest approach we can possibly get. And I will hold the line where I think it's something that I can't vote for. But just sitting here as a Texan and American, if we do not secure the border, we are failing our fundamental responsibility as a republic, as leaders of this republic.
What I don't understand in that context is why would you want to cut, and I'll just say a point, why would you want to cut 8.1% from border security? I understand you listed the particulars, and I get that, which leads me to say, why then would you want to shortchange it? Tough, choices are a thing, but these arbitrary across-the-board cuts are another. And this is what it is, arbitrary in that regard. So that doesn't seem like a serious bill. We
I'm
ought to
trying
get
to be
down the
respectful. It's
real
my
work.
time. I didn't ask a question there. I want to, but
okay.
so we can all move on.
Let us negotiate.
Look, my reason for that, my argument for that would be secure the border, okay? Secure the border. Actually do your job. Actually follow the law. And then come talk to me about what you want in terms of any additional dollars. But you're asking me to forego the power of the purse. That is to say that my responsibility to take tax dollars and borrowed dollars and give it to an administration that is fundamentally leaving the people I represent exposed. And not just my people, New Yorkers, Oklahomans, people across this country, Ohioans, the 10-year-old boy who died in a school bus on the first day of school a month ago. Like, I have an obligation to pressure and force this administration to do its job. And it is beyond my comprehension that I have colleagues on the other side of the aisle who don't seem to care about those policy choices and what it's doing to the people we represent. And I have colleagues on my side of the aisle who are about to walk away from something that we can possibly do here together to get across and send a message loudly and clearly that we should fund a government that will actually do its job and secure the border. So, with that, I mean, I could talk about the border in a significant amount. The only thing I'll just say is this, is that in H.R. 2, again, speaking to a number of folks on our side of the aisle, the amount of strong policies in the H.R. 2 bill cannot be overstated. And for all the folks out there ready to walk away from it, I would just caution you that you are walking away from the most important issue that we're dealing with right now for the people that we represent. And they want us to stand up and fight for them. So I applaud you all for working with us to try to move the ball forward, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for any questions she cares to pose to the panel.
Thank you, Chairman Cole, for yielding. Thank you to the panelists for your testimony. Look, no member of Congress wants to be in a position to have to vote on a CR, but what we're considering here this evening is a conservative approach that places the emphasis exactly where it should be on strengthening our border policies and cutting spending to make an attempt to get our fiscal house in order, something all of us should be able to support. We are in this position for many reasons. More time is required, though, to complete our work. It's not ideal, but that's a fact. I certainly want the appropriations process to resume in regular order as soon as possible. But since we find ourselves here, we have a responsibility to address what Chairman Cole accurately described in his opening statement as one of our core functions, funding the government. It's interesting, every time we consider a spending bill, we hear cries of all the things we are killing or harming from the other side of the aisle. Frankly, it does get old. The left will say if we cut spending even by 1%, we're harming children, veterans, seniors, and basically every interest group they can list. The, quote, parade of horribles, as my colleague from Texas has stated. Here we are, though, when every American family is suffering from Biden's inflation. The cost of food and fuel alone has slashed household budgets. Americans are suffering more every day from Biden's disastrous open border policies. And what are the Democrats doing? Spending more and more and ignoring the porous southern border to the point where they appear to be tone deaf to the cries from constituents in places like New York, who at a press conference recently drowned out several of our colleagues with shouts of, close the border. The United States national debt is at $33 trillion and counting. That's nearly $100,000 per citizen and nearly $245,000 per taxpayer. It's not sustainable, and House Republicans seem to be the only ones in this city who care about trying to fix it. This CR isn't even cutting enough to get us back to pre-COVID spending levels, a time during which most economists agree the United States overspent then and spent more, and now they want to spend even more. We heard our colleague saying he finds these cuts offensive. It's been my experience that the left finds any cuts offensive. You know what I find offensive? Spending away the future of our children and grandchildren without any restraint and without any end in sight. CNN reported in early August that U.S. inflation means families are spending $709 more per month than 2 years ago. That's $8,508 a year when the national median income is only around $74,000 annually. Bidenflation and out-of-control government spending is costing American families more than 10% of their income. That is driving more and more families to food banks, and it will continue to absorb us if we don't try to change the spending trajectory of this country. Let's just remind all of us that this is a CR for 31 days to allow us to continue to do our work. I'm truly not sure why the left is suddenly concerned about DHS funding when they're not doing anything to secure the border anyway. Maybe this will be a come to Jesus meeting. Our friends on the other side of the aisle may finally wake up to the fact that we can't keep printing money, that our southern border must be secure, and we must take steps to get our fiscal house in order. Now that I have said all of that, Representative Bice, turning specifically to the border, I know you care as deeply as I do about the responsibility to protect our communities from the unfettered flow of illegal drugs coming across the southern border. I know that our friends on the other side of the aisle have chosen to close their eyes to the practical effects of the unsecured southern border, but whether you live on the border or in southern Indiana, 1,200 miles away, or in New York, the effects are visible. Representative Bice, I'm hoping you can talk more about the border measures included in the CR and why this CR is a prudent legislative vehicle to address this issue, as Representative Roy has already discussed.
Thank you for the question. And let me first start out by saying the previous comments as it relates to DHS cuts, I would remind my colleagues that money really isn't the issue. The problem is the administration's policies that they keep pushing forward, which has resulted in 7 million illegals crossing into this country in the last 2.5 years. As it relates to the bill and the policies that are being put forward, it's actually very simple. It is things like increasing the number of Border Patrol agents, ending catch and release policies, keeping families with children together while being detained at the border, putting an end to NGOs who are being funded by the government from providing transportation, lodging, or money to got-away immigrants. These NGOs are directly responsible for some of the influx of migrants into cities like New York. Look, this is a crisis. It was mentioned earlier, unmitigated disaster. We are dealing with a unprecedented number of individuals coming into this country. And the other side of the aisle wants to ignore that fact. This is a responsible, conservative bill that looks to do a couple of things. Protect and secure the border, ensure that our military and our veterans are funded, and to cut spending due to the $7 trillion of spending that's come forward in the last couple of years. I think this is reasonable. It's thoughtful. We're trying to come to some sort of, solution here for, frankly, an issue that should have been solved already, that keeps getting ignored at every turn. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you for that response. I just want to say, in Indiana, we got through the 2008 recession by implementing temporary 8% cuts. And we fared better than most other states getting through the recession and coming out in a good position. Representative Bice, Representative Joyce, I really appreciate your work on this issue. Certainly your constituents are lucky to have you representing their interests. Thank you for your testimony. I appreciate you working and your time. And I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from New York is recognized for any questions he may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be very brief. There's been a lot already said this evening on the supposed draconian nature of these funding cuts in the continuing resolution. Specifically, hearing from my colleagues on the other side of the dais bemoan funding cuts is harmful to everyday Americans. When I'm in my district, I'm reminded every day about the harm that the Biden administration has done to the American people because of this president's utter refusal to secure our border and to uphold our immigration laws. Thousands are dying every year in my state, and in your states too, from fentanyl. Communities in my district have been overwhelmed by the relocation of hundreds, approaching thousands of illegal migrants in upstate New York by Governor Hochul and New York City Mayor Adams. New York City's ICE office is fully booked through October 2032, to process illegal immigrants, and the crisis is costing the state of New York $12 billion is what they claim right now, something New York taxpayers simply cannot afford. And what's worse is this entire crisis, from the flood of illegal immigration across our southern border to the migrant crisis straining the resources of communities in our district, to 40 grams of fentanyl, 40 grams, capable of killing 40,000 people, seized in Jamestown, New York, in New York's 23rd Congressional District. That was all completely avoidable. So if we're going to talk about the pain that this straightforward 30-day continuing resolution would cause, so let's also talk about the pain that too many Americans, too many communities have experienced because of the Biden administration's refusal to secure our borders and enforce our immigration laws. I appreciate the work that's gone into crafting this CR to avoid a government shutdown, something I think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would agree we do not want. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else seeking to testify on H.R. 1130, House Resolution 684, or the Continuing Appropriations and Border Security Enhancement Act? Mercifully seeing none, this closes the hearing portions. And the panel is excused with the thanks of the chair, and I'm sure every member up here. You put in a long day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next time you get asked to come before the Rules Committee, think twice.
Okay, the chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Reschenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant H.R. 1130, the Unlocking Our Domestic LNG Potential Act of 2023, a structured rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their respective designees. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Energy and Commerce not printed in the bill shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in this bill as amended. The rule further provides in order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each amendment may be offered only in order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to an amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against the amendments printed in the Rules Committee reported are waived. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.Res. 684, condemning the actions of Governor of New Mexico, Mexico Grisham, for subverting the Second Amendment to the Constitution and depriving the citizens of New Mexico of their rights to bear arms under a closed rule. The rule provides that upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order without intervention of any point of order considered H.Res. 684. The rule provides that the resolution shall be considered as read. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee of Judiciary or their respective designees. The rule further provides consideration of H.R. 5525, the Continuing Appropriations and Border Security Enhancement Act of 2024, under a closed rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against the provisions in this bill. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their respective designees. Finally, the rule provides 1 motion to recommit.
If the gentleman weren't such a good lawyer, he'd be a great auctioneer. So, thank you. Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion. Is there any discussion or amendment to the rule?
Mr. Chairman, I first want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from Representative Sheila Jackson Lee in support of her amendment to H.R. 1130.
Without objection.
And then I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 7 to H.R. 1130 offered by Representative Custer, which clarifies that the Department of Energy shall not deem the export of liquefied natural gas to the People's Republic of China in the public interest unless the Department of Energy and Federal Energy Regulatory Commission jointly certify that liquefied natural gas exports from the United States to China will not increase U.S. natural gas prices. And, Mr. Chairman, this important amendment says that if we are going to export LNG to the People's Republic of China, we should at least certify that it won't increase prices in the United States. Currently, we have those safeguards in place, but this bill eviscerates the careful balance we currently enjoy. So I ask a yes vote on my motion. We should be able to debate Ms. Custer's amendment and vote on it, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion of the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the noes have
Ask
it.
for a roll call.
Roll call's been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess.
Burgess votes no.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey, no. Mr. Norman. No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy. No. Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin. No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy. No. Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. McGovern.
Yes.
Mr. McGovern, yes. Ms. Scanlon. Yes. Ms. Scanlon, yes. Mr. Neguse. Ms. Ledger Fernandez. Yes. Ms. Ledger Fernandez, yes. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
9 nays, 3 yeas.
The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just, I'm going to want to make a brief comment, and I won't offer an amendment on this, but I just want to say, with regard to the continuing resolution here, look, if my Republican friends wrote this without any consultation with any Democrats, I don't think without any consultation with Republicans from the Senate, so this is your bill, you pass it, and if this is what your values represent, so be it. It doesn't represent our values. The cuts in these programs, we find, quite frankly, to be offensive. But I just say this to my friends who say they're fiscal conservatives: across-the-board cuts in everything, with an exemption for the biggest bureaucracy in our government, the Department of Defense. It's hard for me to believe, with the voluminous evidence and article after article written on cost overruns and wasteful defense spending, you can't even find, never mind 8% across-the-board savings, but 1% or 0.5% or an eighth of, or a tenth of a percent of savings there. We all know that there are savings there, and this is not about supporting our troops or about ensuring the defense of our country. I would argue the defense of our country is better served by a tough but lean and efficient Pentagon and military budget. But in any event, I just point that out because for whatever reason, it's okay to cut WIC, but somehow if you're going to cut waste out of a ridiculous missile program that has cost overruns, well, that we can't touch. But in any event, I yield back my time.
Gentlelady have an amendment?
Yes.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make in order amendment number 2 to H.R. 1130 offered by Representative Sorensen, which prohibits the act from taking effect until the Secretary certifies that increased U.S. exports of liquefied natural gas will not increase domestic natural gas prices. Mr. Chairman, at this point in time, when inflation is trending in the right direction, but is still an issue for families across our country, I would hope that we could come together and agree that this bill should not go into effect until we can guarantee that it won't increase our constituents' natural gas prices. Otherwise, all the benefits go solely to the oil companies or the natural gas companies. I'd urge a yes vote on my motion, and I yield back.
Is there any further discussion of the amendment? Hearing none.
Mr. Chairman, I would just also speak in favor of this amendment because we really should be doing everything we can to reduce costs for American families, for American workers. And all this does is say, let's make sure that removing the provision that exports should not hurt the public interest should also make sure that it doesn't rise prices for our American families. And so I support the motion, and with that, you'll...
Well, I will respond. I had not intended to, but Just to make a couple of points, if my friends were worried about the cost, they would rethink their regulatory policies, their Green New Deal policies. All those things have driven up the cost. The reality is, when we opened up export markets for petroleum, we actually saw prices go down, supply go up. There is something called the marketplace out there, and it works. And as painful as the energy prices increase we have, Americans pay less for energy than anybody else in the world. It's not even close, unless you live in a petro state. That's it. So this is an enormously efficient industry. It's worked very well. But again, if my friends are concerned about the cost, they need to relook at their regulatory policies, some of the things they've done. The reality is, we know most folks on your side of the aisle want to drive these folks out of business. They want to end fossil fuels. So that's not going to bring the price down. In the interim, it'll bring it up. So I know this well-intentioned amendment, but I disagree very strongly with the substance. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, the questions on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair and those have it. Roll call's been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess.
Votes no.
Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. No. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Massey. No. Mr. Massey, no. Mr. Norman. No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy. No. Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin. No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy. No. Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse. Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Aye.
Ms. Ledger Fernandez, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
9 nays, 3 yeas.
The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Are there additional amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make and order amendments number 9 and 11 to H.R. 1130 offered by Representatives DeGette and Houlihan. Amendment number 9 reinstates the public interest test for LNG exports to Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, and any other country subject to sanctions imposed by the United States. Amendment number 11 requires the Commission to deny applications with regards to covered foreign countries, which include China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, and any country under sanctions imposed by the United States. Mr. Chairman, I do believe that we should agree that we do not want to be helping our adversaries, especially if it comes at an increased price for our constituents. I urge a yes vote on my motion, and I yield back.
Is there any further discussion of the amendment? Hearing none, the questions on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. Reported vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey, no. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Neguse. Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Aye.
Ms. Ledger Fernandez, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
9 nays, 3 yeas.
The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to. There are further amendments. Hearing no requests for further amendments, questions on the motion to report. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Chair, I ask for a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Burgess.
Burgess votes aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey, aye. Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Ms. Houchin. Ms. Houchin, aye. Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Langworthy, aye. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Neguse. Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
No.
Ms. Ledger Fernandez, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The ayes have it. The motion report's agreed to. Accordingly, Mr. Reschenthal will be managing the rule for the majority.
I will manage it for the minority.
Thank you all. I appreciate everybody here. I know this has been a long day, and these are sometimes contentious issues. And I just continue to be proud of this committee for the manner in which it handles its work, and very proud of the staff, which serves us on both sides of the aisle so well. So without objection, the committee is adjourned.